Hello and welcome to Virus Bulletin 2020. Thank you for tuning in to our presentation on context-aware detection, the future of cybersecurity. I'm your host, Rohit. Cookies and refreshments will be on the left or wherever your kitchen is. If you don't have any, don't worry. We'll try to make this engaging enough so you won't need them. So we'll be talking a little bit about current detection methods, how antiviruses function, modern threats, a little bit about the current state of things, and then we'll talk about context-aware detection technology and how things might look in the future and how we might be able to solve the challenges or the technical challenges that are facing the industry today. Before we dive in, a little bit about me. Some of you may know me as Leo from the PC Security channel. That's the name I go by online. I quite enjoy flying, gliding, when I can in real life. When I can't, I do it in Microsoft Flight Simulator. There's my YouTube silver play button. I also love academics. That's the University of Nottingham. I currently work with the Ingenuity Lab there. And a bonus fun fact, I wanted to be a paleontologist when I was a little kid. And now, instead of digging up dinosaurs, I dig up malware. Interesting transformation, eh? Now a little bit about the PC Security channel, which some of you may have heard of. You might have come across this if you've been looking at AV reviews or tests or videos on cybersecurity. We're one of the most popular cybersecurity channels on YouTube. We're also a business based in London, and we do consulting for enterprises to help them improve their cybersecurity standing. We also work with AV companies and partners on interesting cybersecurity projects. We also create a lot of educational content, so if you're interested in that kind of thing, feel free to check it out. Now, a bit of a prelude. I like to start things off with a quote. So since we're talking about context, I went with this one from Michael Crichton. In the information society, nobody thinks. We expect it to banish paper, but we actually banish thought. Some of you may be familiar with Michael Crichton as the author of Jurassic Park. You may know the novel, you almost certainly know the movie. And I think what he's referencing here is the fact that we get so much of our information through other sources, and we're constantly in these feedback loops or echo chambers. The current world sets so many expectations on us in certain situations that we don't really stop to think. We're just expected to think a certain way or to act a certain way based on that. And so going back to the first principles and thinking from there is something that is lacking in many cases. Hopefully, as we go through the talk, we'll kind of tie into the relevance of this. Here's a bit of a joke about context. So, scientist says, my findings are pointless when taken out of context. Correction published by media. Scientist claims, findings are pointless. Now, the point here is not to bash on media in any sense, but just to point out that sometimes when we're lacking context, it's really difficult for us to notice it, even when it's pointed out to us. With that, let's start talking about modern cyber threats. So what are the challenges we're facing today? We're facing flawless malware, zero-day attacks, in many cases targeted attacks, where attackers have already researched how to get into a specific organization that they want to get into for their financially motivated malicious operation. Hacked systems, something that is typically outside the purview of antivirus. Data breaches. We all hate these, right? Because when a large company has a data breach, it's like, your email is probably there too. Stolen credentials. This ties into things like social engineering, which has become a very common word in cybersecurity these days. We've also got APTs, advanced persistent threats, where we have attackers with significant resources that are highly motivated to break into certain systems. And in many cases, modern detection technology is powerless to stop these threats, or at least stop them fast enough to be effective in preventing any damage. And meanwhile, I came across this file on VirusTotal that all it did was created a pop-up that said, "Happy birthday, Dad," probably made by a kid who just learned how to code, and it's detected by 25 engines on VirusTotal. And I think this is why a lot of modern users are disillusioned with antivirus programs. Not necessarily because they don't like detection technology or they don't like the idea of an antivirus, but because they think, well, if I'm going to be hit by something that's bad enough, the antivirus won't be able to protect me anyway. And if not, all it's going to be is a hindrance. It's going to take up resources. It's going to create annoying pop-ups, and the trade-off is not really worth it, especially with every system now coming with Windows Defender and browsers stepping up their protection game too. So it's not like you have no protection even if you don't use any cybersecurity products that are specifically designed for it. And when we get down to it, I think it's very important to understand that usability is a major concern, and users are often unwilling to trade in their freedoms for protection. Now let's take a look at some modern detection parameters. What do we use to detect malware today, and how does it work? So a common one is digital signatures. Now some solutions rely on this more heavily than others. Then we have import DLLs and functions, the libraries that a program imports, import hash, all that stuff. Packing techniques. Some solutions will detect software that's packed a certain way or an exe file that's packed a certain way. Strings related to the use of certain calls, especially things like encryption, VSS admin. If they're noticed in a program, typically they will trigger detections. File entropy is again a common parameter, especially for certain sections. Section ranges, all of these are just further indicators of different types of packing. TLS features. And the question is, what do any of these have to do with indicating whether or not a file is malicious? I mean, a file not having a digital signature does not mean it's malicious in any sense. Neither does the use of certain DLLs or functions or packing techniques. Maybe it implies that the file is trying to hide something or is designed a certain way, but none of these really fundamentally have anything to do with malice. So the question is, why do we use them? The answer is, well, because they work. Because that's what the malicious authors have used in the past, and that's what we see in most malware. So we realize that if we use these kinds of parameters, we're able to detect malware in a reasonable enough way, and that's why we use them. Now this brings us to whether or not this is proactive as an approach, or is it reactive? And while a lot of solutions are proactive in the sense that they block threats before they execute or they actively look for threats, the technique behind finding the threat itself is actually quite reactive. The current state is malware performs a certain behavior. Analysts research malware. They notice that, okay, this is how the malware got into the system. This family does this, that family does that. And then they create a detection strategy based on what they see after researching the malware and understanding its behavior. And then finally, the product is engineered in a way that it detects that behavior or that kind of PE metadata, as we saw earlier. And you have rules for detection or rules for behavior blockers. The problem with this approach is that eventually the list of malicious behaviors keeps expanding. So as malicious authors realize that, okay, if we have these kinds of parameters in our application, it's going to be detected by AVs. Let's try to do something else. Let's try a different approach. Maybe we shouldn't pack our files this way and instead pack it that way. And as this cat and mouse chase keeps happening, more and more parameters get added to detection, and eventually it becomes impossible to not create false positives. Because ultimately, any behavior can be malicious, and as soon as the malicious authors start using it, you have to detect it. So what do we do about this whole false positive problem? Well, here's a great solution. Let's whitelist all the save files. Which is what a lot of solutions do to begin with. They just have an application whitelist, and if an application's not in that, well, it's blocked, regardless of whether or not it's a prompt created by your son to wish you happy birthday. Doesn't matter. It's not digitally signed. It's not from the list of approved vendors. It's blocked. And we're back to square one. So all of this detection technology that we've developed has really not helped if we have to resort to a whitelist. And if the application's not in the whitelist, we have to throw up a prompt saying, hey user, do you want to execute this application? So in light of these problems, I think it's important to go back to first principles and actually ask the question, what is malware? And I've got another quote from Elon Musk, who likes to say that he tends to approach things from physics framework, and physics teaches you to reason from first principles rather than by analogy. So malware is shorthand for malicious software, and the key word here is malicious, which means characterized by malice, intending to do harm. And if we try to get to the bottom of this, the key thing here is intent. So what exactly is malicious behavior? Well, transferring data to a server isn't malicious. Info stealers are. Crypto mining isn't malicious. Silent crypto miners that do it without the user's consent are. File encryption isn't malicious. In fact, it's a security feature. but ransomware is. And what makes all of these behaviors malicious is context. Without that, it is impossible to tell if a certain operation is malicious or not, because it's not like malware does something that's fundamentally different from safe applications. It's the intent that makes it different. I mean, we could have a file encryption application that all it does is do file encryption one by one, and it asks the user before it does it, and it saves the key so the user can use it to then restore the files when they want to. It just simply encrypts them and decrypts them at the user's notice, and that wouldn't be malicious. But it would still have a lot of the same PE metadata and the parameters that would be used for detection. And I often do come across such files falsely flagged. But I'm not here to just mention the problem, because I think a lot of us are aware that this exists, and especially I understand the frustrations of analysts and researchers trying to detect these threats, trying to find something that maps technically to what malicious intent is, and that's a very difficult problem. One that we've tried to explore. So I'm going to talk a little bit about one of the projects that we're working on right now, which is malX. This is designed to be a cybersecurity testing tool that also is able to analyze files and have a lot more functionality. So here's a little bit about how malX works. It's designed to just launch the suspected malware, gather these PE metadata for static analysis, look at the same kinds of parameters that we mentioned earlier, and then perform dynamic analysis based on the program's behavior and test the system's cybersecurity, and also help us classify the malware, which is supposed to be an interactive process where you take into account what the user says as well. One of the experiments we tried with malX was to classify files into PUPs, malware, and most importantly, irrelevant data. The reason for this was every time we try to test with certain types of feeds, we encounter a lot of files that are just falsely flagged, just broken files that are detected as malware, or files that are just benign, but because they have certain strings or certain kinds of references, most products will flag them and they end up in our feeds. So we tried to solve the problem ourselves. We want to classify things, either it's a PUP, where it's like it's a setup application, it might be malicious, but it doesn't do anything malicious directly, and then malware as something that's a pure threat to the user, and just separate out all sorts of other garbage. Here's a quick screenshot of the actual application running. At the moment, it's just a Python script. We've tried to keep it relatively high level, and also the purpose of using Python is that it's interpretive, so it's very easy to change or modify depending on what we see. So the question of how we make the classifications brings us back to what makes a file malware. I think we can boil it down to basic questions like, does it perform actions that result in a detrimental outcome for the user? Does it perform these actions without the user's consent? Does it hide itself partially or completely from the user? And then we come to this realization that a file isn't really malware. It's the user interaction with the program that determines whether or not something is malware. As I mentioned earlier, you could perfectly have a program that does 90% of what ransomware does, which is encrypt files. But if it interacts with the user in a different way, instead of saying, hey, pay us ransom to get your files back, if it says, here's your program, here's your security key, use the key to get your files, then it's not malware anymore. It's just a security program that the user can use to lock their files. And the fact that user interaction is rarely talked about when discussing malware or how to detect malware, I think is a major problem, because without it, you can't really tell. And we're just classing programs based on their functionality and assuming that a regular user just wouldn't need the kinds of things that malware does, which is, untrue. And also, as mentioned, it leads us into the whole spiral of doom, where it's like malware authors just realize, okay, so a regular user does this, this, and this, and they find a way to write malware using those operations that you just can't block. Or the other way around, you just end up blocking all the operations, but then you have to rely on a whitelist, which makes the entire detection technology irrelevant anyway. And so what I want to do is present some of the parameters that we used to classify our malware, in the hopes that maybe some of these are going to be useful for detection, and I think more and more products might rely on such parameters that are more indicative of user interaction in the future. But let's go over a case here. So let's say an application is a crypto miner. Is it malware? We don't know. So we have to ask the question, how does it interact with the user? And we have to look into what windows it presents. Does it require input from the user before mining begins? Is it persistent? Does it have any hidden components that the user is not aware of or made aware of? Is it easy to remove? Can the user just get rid of it, just stop it, delete it if they want to? Or is it something that digs deep into the system to where you need to have 20 tools to remove it or have to edit the registry yourself? Everything hinges on program user interaction, and I purposefully presented all of these things in a way that they can be converted into technical parameters. Because, of course, as an analyst, you will be looking into all of these things to decide whether or not a program should be detected. But once you make that decision, we don't have technical parameters that closely resemble this decision-making process. Instead, we just have a completely independent process that we use to generate a detection for this program, which doesn't really match with the thought process behind why the program should be detected in the first place. Now, everything mentioned here, windows presented, can be monitored technically. Input from user can be monitored. Persistence, hidden installations, an antivirus can look at this. Is it easy to remove? Again, not very difficult for an application to look at. And with this, I just want to present the undervalued parameters that we came across that we found quite useful, and hopefully you're going to find them quite useful as well when trying to detect malware. Screenshots. Everything that's happening on the screen. You need to know what the user is looking at when the program is doing its operations. Not necessarily in perfect detail, you don't have to completely give up privacy, but you need to have some idea of what applications are open, does it even present a window, and some of this data you can get without screenshots. You can just look at the windows that are open, number of windows, and all of this can be easily monitored. Window titles. What does the application say is being presented to the user? Does it say that crypto miner X is the window and it shows something, or is it a completely different window that says something else? User input. Does the user interact with the application? Is the user hitting any keys? Are they required to click on something before the application proceeds, or does it just continue without any user input? File handles. What other files are being accessed or written by the application? What locations does it work with? And what we've observed with these parameters is that true Trojans these days are quite uncommon, where applications put a lot of effort into disguising themselves as legitimate programs, or they just look like a legitimate program to the user, but they do something malicious. In fact, in most cases, malicious applications just perform their action silently. If you have a hidden backdoor or you have a remote access tool, mostly they will just run on a system, dig into some system process, or they will just create registry entry and do it all silently. So maybe we can framework a different approach for detection. One where a new application or process appears, and if it does not notify or interact with the user and perform sensitive operations without permission or notification, leads to a detection. Now, I'm aware that there are certain behavior blockers that might be doing something like this, but again, I think the key words here are the interaction parts. Does not notify or interact with the user. Perform sensitive operations without permission or notification. And I think in a lot of cases, what detection software does is it just says, oh, perform sensitive operations, detects it as malware. And I think user interaction is really undervalued here because that is really what sets malware apart from legitimate applications. However, I can imagine that some of you might have been a little bit uneasy when I mentioned the use of screenshots for detection. Like imagine having your AV program take screenshots every, X seconds of your system. That does sound very concerning from a privacy standpoint. And I think that is why it's going to be very important moving into the future that AV companies focus on their actual customers, that is the user, not on tertiary benefits like all the advertising data, threat intelligence, etc. With great power comes great responsibility. Not originally coined by Peter Parker or Spider-Man, but Voltaire said something similar during the French Revolution, and that's probably where the quote originates. And that is extremely true for antivirus or any cybersecurity programs, because at the end of the day, you are running at a system level with a lot of privileges. You're getting to collect a lot of sensitive data for security purposes, and you just cannot afford to play fast and loose with it. Telemetry to telemarketing. No thank you. And I think if we're going to go into a future where we're going to use a lot more data and use the understanding of users' interaction with the program to make decisions about whether or not something is malicious, we definitely have to stop using things like that for marketing purposes. AV programs also need to pay attention to vulnerabilities because, as I mentioned, they need a lot of low-level access to the system's operations. And that means if there's a vulnerability in the AV program itself, it becomes a fatal flaw from a cybersecurity perspective. And I think trust is going to be a very important feature for cybersecurity products in the future. Now, some quick credits. Big thank you to the members of TPSC Discord that have really helped with some of these projects, especially Floreagle. Also, a quick shout out to our partners MCSoft. And a big thank you to you, the viewer, for tuning in to this video and making it this far. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out. I'll leave all the information on screen, so you can reach out via email, Twitter, whatever you're comfortable. You can check out our website or YouTube if you like. Also, thank you to VirusBulletin for hosting us. Until next time.